The Cincinnati Bengals have a massive offseason ahead for them, so in this video, I want to go ahead and do my Cincinnati Bengals mock offseason video. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. We are on the road to 10,000 subscribers, so make sure that you're subscribed. Let's hop into it. So the way the video is going to work is we are going to be doing everything that the Bengals are going to be doing in the offseason, beginning by talking about some team assets, how we can open up a little bit of some cap space to make sure that we have enough money to pay players. Then we're going to go over the team free agents. Those are players that we either going to let re-sign or we're going to let walk. Then after that, we'll go over some team needs, what positions they need to look to address. Then we'll go over my free agency plan, and then to end the video off, I'll be doing 2 3-round mock drafts. With that said, we are going to begin with the team assets portion of the video. This one is going to be focused on opening up as much cap space as we can, so that way we can re-sign certain players, i.e. maybe T. Higgins. Now, when it comes to their current assets for 2025, they have around $47 million to work with 6 draft picks. But after cutting a few players and extending some players, we're going to open up over $99 million in cap space. So when it comes to extensions, I'm going to, of course, give extensions to Trey Hendrickson and Jamar Chase. Now, the interesting thing about this extension is that it opens up approximately $27 million this year. But because these contracts are going to kick in next year, you really can't do a whole bunch with that $27 million because, again, these are going to be massive contracts. Trey Hendrickson, I'm projecting a 4-year, $120 million deal. And Jamar Chase, I'm projecting a 4-year, $140 million deal. You take those contracts and also add into the fact that you have other massive contracts like Joe Burrow or Orlando Brown and so on and so forth. You're talking about a team that is going to have a lot of very highly paid players. So when it comes to 2026, 27, 28, this team isn't going to have a ton of money to work with when it comes to cap space. So when we get to the free agency portion of the video, we'll kind of go into further detail about what I'm talking about. Now, in terms of those extensions, again, that does open up approximately $27 million in money that we can work with this year. Now, when it comes to cutting some players, I think this Bengals team has a number of players that this team should consider cutting. When it comes to pre-June 1st cuts, I'm going to be cutting Cordo Volson and Alex Kappa. Both those guys have been veterans on this team for the past few years, have had some good years, but really at this point aren't the best interior offensive linemen. Yes, you're losing a lot of interior pieces, but I do think that there are some potential upgrades in the draft and free agency that this team could really utilize over these declining players. By cutting these players, we're opening up an extra approximately $11 million. Now, I do want to say this, all of my finances, salary cap stuff is projected by Over the Cap, which is a great website if you ever want to look to see your team's salary cap situation. When it comes to post June 1st cuts, I have 2 more players who I think most Bengals fans will agree with. The first player is Sheldon Rankins. He didn't really have the productive season, and based off everything that I have been hearing, it sounds like both sides mutually want to move away. So this one was pretty easy. If you cut him, it opens up around $8 million. And then there's Geno Stone, somebody who I thought was going to be a really good addition for this team, but he just did not pan out in the slightest. He was terrible for this team. If you cut him post June 1st, you're opening up around an extra $60 million. So again, as I said earlier in the video, after my extensions, cuts, and all that stuff, we have opened up $99 million in cap space. Now, in case you're wondering, I did not restructure any deals because really the only restructured deal that would make sense would be like Joe Burrow, but even then, it doesn't really make sense to do so, especially because you're just pushing the money down the line, which I don't think this team should do. So again, we opened up $99 million in cap space, but as I mentioned in the extensions portion where I talked about Hendrickson and Chase, that number can be a tad bit deceiving because a lot of that money isn't going to apply to future years like 2026 and 2027 because you're going to have so many massive contracts. Again, Burrow, Chase, Brown, Hendrickson, potentially T. Higgins, which we'll talk about here in a second. It just doesn't make sense to hand out a bunch of massive contracts because we have $99 million to work with. With that said, with that $99 million, we can go out there and get some veteran players who want to come on some 1 or 2 year deals, which would actually make sense for the Bengals to do. So when we go over who I'm re-signing and who I'm letting walk and who is my free agency plans, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that yes, we have $99 million to work with, but we can't hand out long-term deals to a bunch of players because we just don't have the open cap space in future years. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't think I explained that the best, but I think most of you guys probably have a good understanding of what I'm talking about. Now, in terms of some team free agents, this team has a number of really quality free agents that this team should at least consider to bring back. Right now, you have free agents such as T. Higgins, BJ Hill, Mike Hilton, Trent Brown, Akeem Davis-Gaither, Mike Gesicki, Marco Wilson, Cody Ford, Joseph Osai, Von Bell, Jackson Kirkland, Cameron Sample, and Joe Bachie. A lot of these players are depth options, but also a good number of these players are full-time starters, such as Akeem Davis-Gaither, Trent Brown. Well, I guess not Trent Brown anymore, but he was at one point a starter. Mike Hilton, BJ Hill, T. Higgins. These are a lot of full-time starters that this team should at least consider to bring back. So I think the best way to talk about this portion of the video is by, of course, having the conversation about T. Higgins. Now, when I did this exercise of putting together my free agency plan and draft, the very first thing I did was decide that I wasn't going to re-sign T. Higgins. And that was because I didn't really see a path that was fathomable to sign T. Higgins while also signing other players as well. And even after I cut T. Higgins, I still felt like the team was actually really solid. It just felt like it was missing a piece. So ultimately, I went back in my plan and was like, okay, how can I make this work to where I can sign T. Higgins and still have a productive free agency? Ultimately, I think this team should bring back T. Higgins if the contract works. Now, again, you have a lot of big time deals that you're going to have to maneuver around. Burrow, now Higgins, Chase, Hendrickson, Orlando Brown, so on and so forth. Those are massive contracts that are really going to put a kind of vice grip on this team in terms of what they can do in future free agencies. So this team is really going to have to nail the draft. They're really going to have to nail their veteran signings. And if they do so, they of course can have a chance. But if they fail on those things in future years, it's really going to be difficult for this team to have a lot of success. So ultimately, as I mentioned, we are going to try to bring back T. Higgins in my personal offseason plans. His contract is going to be somewhere along the lines of 4 years, $112 million. That puts him, I believe, approximately around $28 million a year, which puts him as one of the highest paid receivers out there. Now, yes, you could say, well, Metro, a team like New England might offer him $30 million a year. And that might be true, but at the same time, if you are a guy like T. Higgins, who's probably found some comfort with the Cincinnati Bengals, are you willing to take a slight decrease in pay to have a better chance of winning a championship while also playing alongside Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase? Now, you could also say maybe he wants to be a true wide receiver one and wants to go play with a young quarterback like Drake May. At that point, I can't necessarily say you're wrong, but ultimately speaking, I think that they should at least try to bring him back. In my personal plan, I'm going to bring him back on a 4-year, $112 million deal. So after paying him, it's really going to be difficult to hand out any long-term contracts at this point. We can maybe hand out some 2, maybe if we're lucky, a couple 3-year deals, but it's going to be extremely difficult to do so. In terms of the other free agents who I would re-sign, there are some backups who you could at least consider to bring back. Guys like Cameron Sample, Jackson Kirkland, Joe Bachie. Those are just veteran guys that don't cost a bunch. So I'm going to bring back all those guys on just 1-year, $1 million deals. Again, those are depth options. They're not necessarily full-time starters. Now, after signing T. Higgins, I decided to bring back Mike Gesicki as well. He was arguably the 3rd most important player on the offense. That's, of course, not named Joe Burrow. He's a massive part of the offense. I think he's a solid blocker, just a reliable tight end that isn't going to break the bank. He's a little bit older at this point. You probably would prefer to have somebody a tad bit younger, but because this team is in a win-now mode, I think bringing back Mike Gesicki makes a ton of sense. In terms of how much I would pay him, I wouldn't pay him massive amounts of money, but I'm going to project somewhere along the lines of a 2-year, $12 to $14 million deal. I'm going to stick to 12 for my personal plan. Based on his productivity, I do think that he is due for a pay increase, which is why I gave him a little bit more of a heavier deal than what he signed last offseason. The next player that I would re-sign would be Cody Ford. Again, kind of similar to guys like Jackson Kirkland, Cam Sample, and Joe Bachie, Cody Ford is a really reliable depth piece, but even in the sake for Cody Ford, he could be a potential full-time starter for this team next year. He's not great. He's not really particularly special or anything like that, but what he is reliable. He's consistent. He knows every single position, so I think you at least have to try to bring him back. I brought him back on a 2-year, $8 million deal. But outside of that, this team really cannot afford to pay a lot of their key guys like BJ Hill, Mike Hilton, Akeem Davis-Gaither. I tried my best to bring back Mike Hilton, but it just didn't really make much sense for this team long term. So in free agency, we have a lot of work to do. Because we brought back T. Higgins, it really changed what we can actually do in terms of who we can bring back and who we can sign. But I do think that we did a pretty solid job. Let's now go over some team needs. So in terms of some team needs, because we really didn't bring back a lot of people that this team had, we have a bunch of not necessarily new, but even more extreme issues on this team. Positions like defensive line, cornerback, safety, interior offensive line, and running back. I still think running back could be a bit of an upgrade, but it's a distant issue compared to defensive line, cornerback, interior offensive line, and so on and so forth. So because of that, we need to maneuver around the offseason by projecting certain players to improve, while also bringing in veterans who are willing to come in on not necessarily small deals, but workable deals. So the first player who I'm going to bring in to really add a nice solid piece to the interior defensive line, and honestly might be a slight upgrade over BJ Hill and probably cost a little bit cheaper, is Jarran Reed, the interior defensive lineman for the Seattle Seahawks. He's coming off one of his best years, and I still don't really think that you're going to have to pay him that much money. In terms of how much I think that he should get paid, I'm projecting somewhere on the lines about a two-year, $16 million deal, which puts him around $8 million annually. What he brings is a veteran presence in the interior defensive line. He's a proven commodity. He has shown the ability to be a solid pass rusher while also still being decent enough in run support. I still think that he is a 3-down interior defensive lineman, so I think he makes a bunch of sense. It's also likely that he won't be returning to Seattle because of course, Byron Murphy, who they took in the first round last year, so I do think that he is a real possibility. Sticking to the defense, I wanted to find an upgrade in the free safety room, and I think the best player available here that makes some sense is Julian Blackmon from the Indianapolis Colts. I know I said I didn't want to hand out too many long-term deals, which in this case, this contract is going to be a 3-year, $24 million deal, which again also puts them at $8 million annually. The thing I feel with Julian Blackmon is I know what I'm getting. I'm getting a guy who is a good coverage guy. He's not necessarily great in run support, but coverage is his specialty. That's something that this team really missed this year with, having Geno Stone be really poor in coverage and Von Bell getting playing time and not being that good either. Julian Blackmon is a good coverage safety, and I think would be a good fit for this team. Sticking to the defense, now that we don't have Mike Hilton, I think we need to find an upgrade in the nickel room, and I think the best nickel available in this offseason is arguably Jordan Lewis of the Dallas Cowboys. He had some inconsistent years early on with Dallas, but these past 3 years, he has just found a nice rhythm and groove as that slot corner nickel role. You're not going to really see him play on the outside too much. He is a special nickel back type of guy. You're not going to move him around a ton, but that's kind of what this team needs, especially because they lost out on Mike Hilton. Jordan Lewis is good in run support. He's solid in coverage. He can make some plays. I think he's an upgrade over Mike Hilton. That being said, he will be a little bit costly. I'm projecting somewhere along the lines of a similar deal to Julian Blackmon, somewhere along the lines of 3 years, $21 million, which puts him around $7 million annually. So those are the only defensive pieces that I really could realistically bring back on this team. Again, Jarran Reed on the interior defensive line, Jordan Lewis as your nickelback, and Julian Blackmon as your safety. If those contracts might seem a little bit too big, I think that a lot of those contracts make some sense. I also do believe that if you are the Bengals, you could potentially put a team option on a contract like Julian Blackmon to where that 3rd year, you can either accept the team option or you can decline the team option. Now, when it came to the offensive side of things, I didn't really feel a need to bring back or to bring any sort of weapons on the outside like a tight end, receiver 3, or running back or anything like that. The biggest thing that I wanted to address was the interior of the defensive line, primarily the left guard and right guard position. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to find 2 pieces, a younger guy and a proven commodity. The proven commodity that I'm going to bring in on a 1-year deal is Greg Van Roten. While he isn't necessarily a great player, he is somebody who's a little bit older, is a kind of a 1-year bridge guy who can just play for 1 year for this team while we look to upgrade that either through free agency next year or in the draft potentially this year or next year. I project he's only going to get a 1-year, $3 million deal. He's somebody who isn't great, but is quality enough to be that guy for 1 year. The next player we're going to bring in is a extremely underrated player. He hasn't had a ton of productivity over the course of his career, but in 2024, he had sort of a big explosion of a year, that being Jordan Meredith, the left guard for the Las Vegas Raiders. He isn't somebody who I think is going to require a massive contract because, again, he hasn't really had a whole bunch of long-term success on this Raiders team. It's kind of just been this year, but over the course of 574 offensive snaps, he has a PFF overall grade of 80.8 with a pass blocking grade of 75.7 and a run blocking grade of 78.4, allowing 0 sacks on the season. Because he is a bit more unproven and a bit more of a question mark, I didn't want to give him a long-term deal, so I'm projecting somewhere along the lines of a 2-year, $10 million deal. But that is really it for the offensive line. Again, Greg Van Roten at right guard, and then Jordan Meredith at left guard. So that is it for my free agency plan. Again, to kind of recap things, we brought in Jaron Reed, we brought in Julian Blackmon, and we brought in Jordan Lewis. And then offensively, we brought in Greg Van Roten, and of course, Jordan Meredith. I think with these upgrades, we did find some pieces to add on the defense to really make this defense a bit more of a better unit. All those guys as well, Reed, Blackmon, and Lewis, have played in the NFL for multiple years and are proven commodities. But on the offensive side of things, I had to take a bit more of an unorthodox route because I couldn't hand out massive contracts to guys like Will Fries, who are great guards and so on and so forth. But bringing in a proven commodity in Greg Van Roten and a guy in Jordan Meredith, who I think could really outplay his contract, makes a bunch of sense to me. So after all those deals, we still have approximately $30 million to work with. I think with the leftover amount of money that we have available, I'm projecting that the Bengals would probably sign a bunch of rotational backup options on 1, maybe 2-year deals. The reason why I didn't include that in this video is because a lot of those names most of you guys won't know, and if you do know, it won't be terribly interesting, so I didn't want to waste your time nor my time. But with that all said, let's now go ahead and hop into my 2 3-round mock drafts. So as you can see, we are on the PFF mock draft simulator, and we have the 17th overall pick. We actually are going to be doing the first 3 rounds, so we have 3 overall picks to work with here. In terms of who is available on the board, I really do like Kelvin Banks, but I don't project him likely to play at guard. I think that he is more of a certified tackle, so it doesn't make much sense to take him here. I think this team really needs to look to address the edge rushing room, and of the guys available, I do think James Pierce Jr. is by far the best pass rusher of the guys available. I do like Mykel Williams, but I don't think that he's as good as James Pierce Jr. He's somebody who I think will probably be taken around this spot, so I think it does make sense. He is a really good pass rusher who's just a little bit of a developmental piece right now because he doesn't have necessarily the size that you would want in that position, but I think when it comes to pass rushing moves, get off, bend, so on and so forth, he's probably your guy. So after we took James Pierce Jr., the one thing that I really want to look to address is finding some young pieces on the interior of the defensive line. Yes, you took a couple guys last year like McKinley Jackson and the other guy as well, and we also did bring in Jaron Reed, but I would like to have a rotation of around 4 guys that I feel pretty confident about, especially having Jaron Reed only on a 2-year deal. We might want to look to find a piece that could be a part of this team in the long term. Of the guys available, I really feel good about all 3 of these guys, those being Alfred Collins, Deon Walker, and Derek Harmon. I do think one of these 3 guys could potentially become available in the 3rd round, but since we're already here, I'm probably going to take the highest upside guy of these 3, and to me, that is Derek Harmon. He is a bit of a riskier project player, but 5 sacks this year, 43 hurries, 2 batted balls, and played a bunch of defensive snaps that was really productive for the Oregon Ducks. I think Derek Harmon is probably the best of these 3, so I'm going to go ahead and take him. By the way, the rankings of these players are not updated. I do think Derek Harmon in the final updated version of these rankings will be a lot higher. When it comes to the 3rd round, I want to look at interior offensive linemen as well as offensive tackle. Unfortunately, I don't really love a lot of these names, but I do think Tate Ratledge might be the guy I go with. Had some injuries for Georgia, but when he was healthy, was a pretty productive player for the Georgia Bulldogs. He's probably somebody who's going to be sitting behind Greg Van Roten for a year, or even could potentially move inside to center if need be, but I think that he could develop behind Greg Van Roten and potentially become a starter at some point in the future. So that concludes our first mock draft. As you can see, James Pierce Jr., Derek Harmon, and Tate Ratledge. Let's go ahead and move on to my second 3-round mock draft. So the way the board fell here kind of felt similar to the last portion of the video, but I think this time I want to try to look at potentially taking a cornerback in the 1st round. Now, Benjamin Morrison, in my opinion, is a bit of a unique prospect because I think when healthy, last year, he was one of the best corners out there, but dealt with some injuries that are really concerning. I believe a hip injury. There's also some concerns that he actually might just end up going back to college this year. I do not believe that he's declared quite yet, but if we assume that he does go, I do think Benjamin Morrison might be the pick here. He might have the highest upside. I do like Jahdae Barron, but his size is a little concerning. I do like his versatility, and I don't really have too many issues with him in terms of coverage. I think his technique is very sound. But what I do worry about with Jahdae Barron is, does he have the long-term speed? Does he have the size? Those, to me, are concerns that I don't really feel that much with Benjamin Morrison. Granted, he's coming off a bit of an injury. I also really do like Darian Porter, although he's kind of a little bit of a late riser, especially this year. I also really like Siobhan Revel. In this scenario, though, I am going to go ahead and take Benjamin Morrison Morrison because I do believe that he has the highest upside of being a true cornerback one on a team. If hypothetically by the time this video comes out and then of course Morrison isn't going in the draft, just take Jahdae Barrett, and I think he can also be a really good player. Now in the second round here, I want to look to find an edge rusher. Unfortunately, a lot of the guys who I really like are no longer on the board, but I do think that there are a couple guys who I'm a big fan of, and you guys might not like this, but Braden Swinson is going to vastly outplay this rank. I think by the time the final rankings come out, I could see Braden Swinson becoming a third, second round pick. And because I do think that he's going to move up the draft board, I think there's going to be some people that disagree with the pick of Braden Swinson, but I truthfully do think that Swinson is a much better player than Jared Ivey. I think he had like somewhere along the lines of like a 33% pass rush win rate, which is just ridiculous. 9 sacks on this season. Yes, he didn't play it that well in 2023, but golly, when it comes to being a pass rusher, I think he has the size, the look, the speed, could put on some pounds, could work on some pass rush moves, but I do think that he could be a really good player. And again, I would take Braden Swinson over basically every single one of these players, and I do believe in an actual draft, he might be taken in the second round. Now, with that said, there are some other names who I think we at least should consider. Omar Norman Lott, we didn't add a defensive interior in the first round, so maybe we'll look there. We could also even look at Cameron Williams and potentially move him inside to guard, although I think he's probably more set as a tackle. We could also just go back to, of course, taking Alfred Collins again, or we can even take Tyler Booker. And honestly, I think that is where I might end up going because he did fall to the second round. I do think Tyler Booker is an underrated prospect. He is somebody that isn't going to fit a zone scheme, but I don't really believe that the Bengals are that heavy with zones, so I think Booker could make some sense here. But in the third round, obviously, we talked about Braden Swinson a lot earlier, so I think in this spot, we are going to take him. Again, I think that he could potentially be taken as high as in the second round. I think he will vastly outplay this ranking, and I do believe that by the time the PFF comes around to updating their rankings, I would suspect that Braden Swinson is going to be a lot higher. Just watch his highlights. He's a freaking star. So that then finishes my second 3-round mock draft. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, what changes would you make to my personal mock offseason for the Cincinnati Bengals? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And again, what would you do differently? But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.